Well, hello there. I am Brian Goulet of GouletPens.com, here with a special guest, Robert Goulet. Okay, not really, obviously, but I do have a question about Robert Goulet, so you are getting a 2-for-1 Goulet Q&A today. So Robert will be coming back in a minute. Sorry, Robert, if ever I would leave you, it wouldn't be in Q&A, but Robert's going to stay over there so he doesn't distract you with his mustachio look. I don't know why I said mustachio. Anyway, so what I've been up to last week or so, did physical inventory this past Wednesday. We had to shut down the site for a little bit. You know, if you've been following us for a while, you know this is something we do every quarter or so, you know, just to readjust our inventory, make sure that everything's reconciled, make sure that we actually have the things on the shelf that we say that we have on the shelf, and so on. So it's a benefit to you that we do that. It's just a little temporary blip, but went off pretty smoothly. Madigan from our media team here. She's a community coordinator. You see her on Twitter, on the blog. She does a lot with Monday Matchup and Instagram. She just got married this past weekend, so congratulations to her and her new husband. We're really happy for both of them for sure. And we've had some new products that have launched recently. The Cross Classic Century launched on Wednesday. It's a very, very thin pen. I actually don't have one here. I put it back on the shelf already, but very thin pen. So got a video on that I put out, what was it, Wednesday. So go check that out. Also, just got word about the Pilot Vanishing Point stub nibs. I actually found out about them a little while ago, but I had to keep it on the DL. So now it's finally public information, so shared, got a video out about that as well. So I'm pretty excited. Actually, I'm very excited about that nib. It's a really great writing stub nib. If you already have a Vanishing Point, it's going to be available in its own nib unit that you can put into one. And I think a couple of pen models are going to be available with it as an option. Not sure which ones yet. But that'll be available in a rhodium and a black nib as well. So that's pretty cool. And then we got cross ink and converters and stuff to go along with some of the other cross. So that's it for new products now. We're going to be coming out with some other new stuff here in the coming weeks as well, as we're getting into the cross brand especially. So that should be pretty fun. And then we're going to be launching or announcing the summer Edison Nouveau premiere that is going to be coming out pretty soon too. Right now we're photographing it, going to shoot a little video on it, and we plan to announce it next week, I believe. So look out for that. So let's get into the questions here. I got a bunch of them. I got 14 questions. So I'm going to try to rock and roll a little bit. First question, this is in the pens and writing category. This one is from Yunus S. on Facebook. I watched your video on how to travel on an airplane safely, but as a pilot, I'm curious to learn your recommendation if I try to use the pen for our paperwork on it. Okay, so you're talking about context of fountain pens here. You didn't say that specifically, but I'm very much assuming that's the context you're talking about here, Yunus. So yes, if you are flying with a fountain pen, you know, honestly, it scares more people than it probably should. It's kind of rare that I hear about anything notable that happens as regarding an ink spill or anything like that on a plane. I have flown many times in the last year or so, and I've brought all different kinds of pens. I've very intentionally brought pens that I've filled like halfway and turned upside down, and I want to get them to leak. And it's rare that it's anything really noteworthy. So it's really not probably as scary as most people think. That said, if you're a pilot and you're flying all the time, then you know you're obviously going to be kind of taking the risk a little bit more. Certainly some pens handle things better than others. I think the ones that tend to be the worst, if you will, are like eyedropper and like very large ink capacity pens, especially if it's anything bladder filled. I think that's where they kind of got more of the bad rep, was back, you know, in the earlier days of flying where their cabin pressurization wasn't as good, maybe, and you had a lot of bladder filling pens with high ink capacities, and people would be flying with them in their shirt pocket and stuff like that. So, but these days I really don't hear about much going on with them. Now that said, I've talked to some pilots about like, what is it? You know, because I've got several kind of pilots who are fountain pen fans, and I email back and forth with them about, you know, hey, do you ever take your pens on planes? And what has your experience been? Can you teach me a little bit about the altitude and all this kind of stuff? So kind of what I've been able to surmise, and I am no aeronautical engineer or whatever, if that's even the right term, but I'm definitely no like super knowledgeable person on this subject. This is just from talking to a couple of people. From my understanding, the biggest risk is when you're ascending. So from takeoff to when you hit about 6,000 to 8,000 feet elevation, from what I understand, that's about where the cabin tends to pressurize, is about where it would be at 6,000 or 8,000 feet. So that ascension is when you have the most pressure decrease. And so what happens when you have a fountain pen, the pressure in the air, surrounding air, is decreasing. And if you have ink with air, like if you have a halfway filled ink chamber, the air inside is at a higher pressure than the relative pressure as you're ascending. And then that's going to cause it to want to equalize. And the only way it can do that, if your pen is oriented in such a way where the nib is between the air and the surroundings, the air will force ink through the feed. Does that make sense? If you have your pen nib pointed up, that pretty much eliminates that fear, because basically what's going to happen, the air inside your ink chamber is going to be at the top, and any pressure change is just going to go straight out, and the ink is just going to stay in the bottom and be perfectly fine. That, or if you keep your pen filled up really, all the way, there's really no air inside the pen to pressure and equalize, so that's okay. So that said, there's a couple of options for you if you are flying a lot. Keeping your pen's nib pointed up pretty much eliminates any issues right there. It's only if you have them like sideways or upside down that you're risking things. Or keeping it filled all the way, kind of like I just mentioned. Or there's some pens that just handle it better than others. For example, if you have a TWSBI VAC 700 or Pilot Custom 823, they are VAC fillers, and when you have the knob screwed down, it has a O-ring that actually blocks off any, whatever contact with the outside world for that ink chamber. So it blocks off the ink chamber so that you can fly and do whatever you want, and it's not going to affect anything. That's part of the reason people like VAC fillers if you fly a lot. So that might be an option. And I've also heard that the Platinum Preppy actually does pretty well. Maybe not an eyedropper converted Preppy, but just a regular one, or if you just keep it nib pointed up. I've had one pilot specifically I emailed with back and forth who uses a Preppy, says he flies all the time, doesn't even really think about it very much, and he's never had an issue. So that's something to take into consideration as well. So the thing I will say though is, like, most of the risk is on the ascent, which I would think as a pilot, that's probably not when you're writing a lot of things down, but I don't really know. I've never flown in that, like been on a plane, but I've never actually flown. That's not even how you fly a plane, but in my mind, that's how you fly a plane. Like whatever you do, joystick, I don't know. Depends on the plane, I guess. But, when you're doing your ascension, that's probably not when you're like diligently taking notes. Probably like when you're equalizing or whatever. So once you've kind of hit that 6,000 to 8,000 feet, from my understanding, you can take out your pen and write, and it's really not a problem. And then especially on the descent, the pressure is increasing, so then you really don't have to worry about it, because the pressure inside the pen, it would actually be forcing the ink back up into the pen, so you even have to worry about it less then. So it's really just in the initial ascent that it is really an issue. So that's kind of what I say there. So don't be too fearful, don't use like a permanent ink and store it in your best shirt or something like that. But maybe experiment with it a little bit. Maybe just fly a few times and just fill your pen with water and just kind of see how it does, just to experiment. All right, next question I have. This is Poe L on Facebook. Asked how to swipe off the ink on the surface of the nib after filling from a bottle of ink. Whenever I swipe the excess ink with a paper towel, it will draw ink to the surface of the nib. Okay, yep, this happens a lot. So, you ink up your pen, you're supposed to submerge the entire nib into it so that it'll actually draw fully. Great. Then you've got a little bit of, ink on your grip, and you got some ink on the surface of the nib. So you wipe it off with your paper towel or whatever that you use. And then when you do that, you notice there's a little bit of ink there on the slit. So you wipe it and wipe it and wipe it and wipe it, and it keeps coming back, and you wipe it to the side, and you wipe it down the middle, and you wipe it back and forth and everywhere, and no matter what you do, there's a little bit of ink that's still on there. Well, that is called nib creep, and that essentially is not something you're going to be able to eliminate. Some inks do it worse than others. Some pens do it worse than others. It's purely an aesthetic thing, so you really don't need to be concerned about it. It's not going to hurt anything, and actually, I personally kind of like it, because when I have a lot of different pens inked up, which I do, I'll usually ink up different colors so that I can use them, and I'm not the best at like taking notes on which specific ink I'm using in a pen. If I'm doing a review or trying to do something like kind of scientific, yeah, sure, okay, I will take note of it. But if it's just a pen I'm bipping around on, you know, I can usually remember what ink that I'm using in it, and if I can't, I'll clean out the pen. So for me, it's more a matter of just knowing like, oh yeah, what color ink do I have in this pen again? Oh yeah, okay. So for me, having a little bit of nib creep on the nib, I can just look at it and see, first of all, is it a pen that's inked up or is it one that is clean and dry? So I can tell that just by a glance, or I can tell like, oh, that's a purple ink or that's a red ink or whatever. You can tell just by the nib creep there. So it's perfectly okay to stay there. You really don't need to sweat it too much. Some people are kind of weirded out by nib creep, but I actually have kind of grown to love it, mainly because to try to get rid of it is really tough, and you're going to limit your ink choices and really frustrate yourself a lot if you try to eliminate it completely, because it's a pretty rampant issue that happens on a lot of pens. Kevin L has a question on Facebook. This is a good one, okay? So this one is not going to be a super exciting question, but it is interesting. So when a pen comes with a warranty, whether it's a 1 year or a lifetime or whatever, is it ever worth violating that warranty to take the pen apart to do some extra cleaning or whatever? TWSBI encourages tinkering, and with a Jinhao or similar brands, that's not a concern, because lower price. I've seen various videos on how to take apart the upper priced pens, and they all come with a warning about warranties being voided if you try this at home. What's your opinion on this? Okay, this is a good question because, you know, as a tinkerer and as a retailer who officially represents manufacturers, I have to straddle a line sometimes. So I will say, like, when I am taking apart pens and stuff like that, I will almost always, if I can remember to say, that be conscious that whatever you're doing at this point now could be considered a violation of your warranty, so just be aware of that. So when I say that, and I know there's other people, like Stephen Brown does a lot of disassembly videos and stuff, he has disclaimers and whatnot. Essentially it's like a CYA kind of situation. We just don't want to be like you to do something and then get really pissed off and come after us and say like, you know, hey, you took apart your pen and I took mine apart and now it's broken and I'm mad at you. Well, okay, you know, it's like when you're taking a pen apart, realize that you are assuming responsibility for that. Just like if you buy a car and you go to replace your own alternator, whatever you do replacing your alternator, you're responsible for, you know? So it's like, from the manufacturer's perspective, anything you're doing beyond the normal use of the pen, which for most pen companies is writing, filling with ink, and cleaning. Anything beyond that, most pen companies would say, you shouldn't be doing it because we can't control what you're doing, and if you break something, we can't be held responsible, and all this kind of stuff. Because in general, a lot of people don't know how to take apart their pens, and people do mess things up, and you know, it's really tough as a manufacturer to then, you know, come back with that. And pens made these days generally don't disassemble as easily as they used to in like the vintage era of fountain pens. That and just in general, I've had a lot of conversations with this, with Nathan Tardif of Noodlers. He's been, you know, he makes his pens very much to be tinkered with, even like heat setting ebonite feeds and stuff like that. Still, a lot of people just have a hard time with that. I think just in general, we are in a much more disposable society, so people aren't as familiar with how to fix things and how to tinker with things as they used to be a generation or two ago. So manufacturers have manufactured their pens to be a little less, you know, tinkerer friendly than they used to be. So that kind of exacerbates the issue a little bit, but I think it's been almost in a defense of, you know, they've manufactured pens so that you really don't have to mess with them very much because most people don't know how to mess with them. Does that make sense? So when you do get into this world of starting to disassemble your pens, which means, you know, anything beyond just normally filling and cleaning the pen, you know, and usually not like a Jinhao or something really inexpensive, but some of the, you know, pricier pens will have, which I would consider things like in the, you know, $40, $50 range and up. They'll often have like instructions with how to clean and fill your pen and stuff like that. So they'll have like normal use and care instructions in there. It's when you get beyond that that you're really taking your pen life into your own hands. So whenever you're pulling out nibs and feeds, whenever you're, you know, a piston mechanism and you're trying to disassemble it and that kind of thing, it's actually somewhat rare for a company like Noodlers or TWSBI, for example, to not only allow you to do that, but then like give you a wrench to be able to take your pen apart. And I can't even tell you how many people have trouble getting their TWSBI back together. I've shot several videos on that, and that is an issue sometimes, and some people, you know, screw it up and they damage their stuff and they don't know what they're doing, and it's okay, you know. It's like, I don't get upset when people do that, but you just have to realize that when you're taking something apart, you are assuming responsibility for whatever happens. And so it's, as far as like a warranty type situation goes regarding disassembly and reassembly, I don't think it's so much that if you take apart your pen at all and put it back together and it's perfectly fine, that's considered a warranty violation, because essentially the pen should function well if you do it right. So there's no need for a warranty, you know, claim. It's only if there's some kind of a defect or something like that. So if the writing in the pen is not functioning properly, that's really a warranty situation. But if you take apart a pen and you put it back together and you strip the threads, or you lose a piece, or you crack something because of what you have done to disassemble and reassemble it, that's when you voided the warranty. And they're going to say, well, you took it apart and we didn't tell you to do that, so that's really on you. And then you're pretty much going to have to pay for a repair, if they even have repairs, depending on who the company is. So that's where the disclaimer comes from. Now, some other things you might see is like nib tuning and adjustment and smoothing and stuff like that. That always violates warranty. Always, because then you are altering the product. And as soon as you do that, pen companies are like, you've changed it, we're not going to, you know, as soon as you smooth that nib, they're not going to take it back for any nib issues in the future because you've altered it. Now, the one thing that I can say is that I've talked to a couple of different companies, and you know, it's not like if you break the seal on any one aspect of the pen, like the whole thing is void of warranty. It's only going to be like if you smooth your nib and then your piston goes funky and it doesn't work anymore. You can still send it back and say like, hey, I've got a piston issue. If your issue is not at all with the nib, the one part that you've altered, they shouldn't have a problem with that. You know, depending on how picky they are, and I can't really say like definitively that that's always going to be, because it's always going to depend on kind of who's reviewing the pen. You know, it's like, you know, I'm just using a TWSBI for an example because I have a later question that I'm going to use a TWSBI, but you know, if you smooth out your TWSBI nib and it writes great, but all of a sudden your piston just it cracks or does something crazy that it shouldn't be doing, then, you know, TWSBI would fix that thing, and they wouldn't have a problem with the fact that you altered the nib or whatever. And another point is when you're getting a nib smooth or ground or done whatever through a Nibmeister, you're violating the warranty from the original manufacturer on that nib as well. I don't know if you're aware that that happens, but that is definitely the case because it is being permanently altered. So in that case, any nib issues, you would then go back to the Nibmeister and have to work it out with them. But you couldn't have a nib custom ground from a Nibmeister from Pelican or whoever and then say, go back to Pelican and say, my nib's not writing well. And they'd be like, well, this isn't the nib that we put on it anymore, you know, because it's been altered. So you need to go back to whoever you took it to. So that's a whole different kind of situation. So that's kind of where I stand with that. So really, just to summarize everything here, ultimately, it's your call whether you want to, you know, void any type of warranty by taking apart a pen further than it's instructed in the manufacturer's directions. And the kind of last thing that I'll say regarding all of that is usually, even if there's a warranty thing and they'll cover it all, there's almost always a shipping charge that you'll have to cover. So it's really going to depend on the value of the pen and whether it's worth it to you. And there's almost always a lead time as well. So there's going to be some kind of threshold that you personally will feel is worth it or not to do a warranty claim on a pen that you might have an issue. It may just be an aesthetic thing, you know, a little scratch or a little whatever that is not as big a deal to you maybe, or some kind of something like that. So it's always going to be a judgment call. You know, you may be dealing with $10 to $20 of shipping costs. So if you have a $500 pen, yeah, okay, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad. If it's a $30 pen, it's probably not going to be worth it to you. So the best thing to do is look the pen over, you know, and make sure that whatever retailer that you're buying it from, that you know what their policies are. For us, we have a 90-day policy that's pretty much like, you know, use the pen whatever and it's 90 days. If you're actually inking it up and writing with it, we do charge a restocking fee because we have to clean it out and assess it, and there's true costs incurred with us having to kind of re-inspect that pen once we get it back. But if you get a pen and you're like, this piston is just not functioning properly, and you send it back to us, it's no problem. You know, we'll even cover shipping and all that kind of stuff if it's a defect like that. If it's a matter of preference, that's another situation. That's when you need to know kind of where your retailer stands. and then every retailer's got a different thing. So it is a little bit complicated. You got to know where the retailer stands and kind of where they draw the line. You got to know where the manufacturer stands and where they draw the line. You got to look at shipping costs and all this kind of thing. So it can be a bit of a hassle sometimes, depending on what the situation is. And where it really gets sticky is when you have pens in like that $30 to $70 range, where it's like, I know there's going to be like a shipping charge if I have any warranty issues. Is it really worth, you know, that? So that's where it can help to like read reviews and see kind of what the popular opinion is on any given pen, to see kind of what the risk is. But you know, life is just a series of calculated risks. You know, you take a risk getting out of bed in the morning and taking a shower, you know, so it's like you can't ever completely eliminate risk, but it's all a matter of calculated risks. So reading reviews and stuff like that can help to you know, curb some of that. So hopefully that helps you out, Kevin. Hopefully that answers questions for a bunch of you. And I'm happy to follow up with more of that if you have questions in the comments as well. I got one paper question this week. This question's from Emily H. on Facebook. I'm interested in the Habanichi, which uses Tomoe River paper. I was wondering, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using Tomoe River paper? I've never used the Habanichi, but I've kind of heard about it. If it's the same, if it's literally the same Tomoe River paper, then I'll just speak purely about the paper. I can't speak about that notebook format. Tomoe River is very thin. It's just about 50 grams, as opposed to like Rhodia, which is 80 grams. So it's a very noticeably thinner paper. However, the reason people go so nuts over Tomoe River is it holds up to ink remarkably well, given how thin it is. So if you're using any ink that has a sheen to it, Tomoe River tends to bring that sheen out quite a bit, and it really resists feathering and bleed through a lot. So it performs really remarkably well, especially given how thin it is. So that's kind of the advantage, is if you want a thin paper, you know, it's going to handle your inks really well, and it feels cool, and it's a very kind of soft paper. It's nice to write on, and if you're mailing a letter or something like that, it's just a really unique kind of paper that, you know, it's sort of like if you have Crown Mill or something like that, or you know, Gilalo, it feels like nice correspondence paper. It doesn't feel like you used a sheet of copier paper. Disadvantages, it is kind of expensive, and because it's so thin, it's really good. It resists bleed through and feathering really well, but because it's so thin, you can almost always like see ghosting. You can see what you've written on the other side when you flip the page over. So if you're trying to write two-sided, depending on your ink and pen combination, it can compete with whatever you're writing with on the back of it. So oftentimes it's best just to write on one side of it. So you know, it's a correspondence paper really, so that's okay. Well, the Habanichi, I don't know. If it's more in a notebook format, it might be more of an issue. Correspondence paper, it's usually not as much an issue, because I think most people tend to write just one-sided when they're writing correspondence, but you know, that's kind of to each his own. So that's kind of the biggest disadvantage, I guess, of it. Let's talk ink. All right, I got several ink questions this week. This first one is from Ricky J on Facebook. Ricky asks, what dark blue inks with sheen do you suggest for use on average paper? Hilroy paper in Canada, one that goes in the binders. I don't know what that paper is, but we'll just assume it's like a mid-grade paper. The one blanket disclaimer I'm going to say is, if you're using an average paper that's somewhat absorbent and stuff like that, don't expect a lot of sheen from any ink, because that is what kills sheen. Absorbency in paper, it sucks the life out of the sheen, the inks that sheen. It'll do it with, you know, 1670 inks. It'll do it with, you know, any of these other inks that I'm going to name you, which I'm just realizing now I forgot to mention. Blue Ocean. So let me add that to my list. I have a list of like things that I think through, so I'm not just talking off the top of my head. So anyway, with that little disclaimer out of the way, I have no idea how that paper actually performs. It might be just fine. But my favorite sheening inks, just, you know, whatever paper you're using, these inks are going to be the best sheeners that I can think of. My personal favorite for a dark blue ink is Diamine Majestic Blue. It's very dark and has a red sheen. It just looks gorgeous. The newest, most notable one is J.Erbon Blue Ocean. It was redone so that it has a gold sheen to it, a very intense gold like sparkle. That is just awesome. It's not quite as dark as Majestic Blue, but it's still fairly dark. Private Reserve Electric DC Blue, that's going to be really similar to Diamine Majestic Blue. As well as Noodler's Autumn and Azure is going to be very similar to Majestic Blue and Electric DC Blue. I've also got Diatramentis Indigo Blue, which is going to be very similar as well. Diamine Blue Velvet, which is awesome. It's one of their anniversary inks, and it really looks amazing. And then Diamine Regency Blue as well. Pretty much all of these, with the exception of Blue Ocean, that one's got the gold sheen, pretty much all these are going to be a dark blue with a reddish sheen to them. I don't know, it must be something about that dye group that can have that red sheen, but that's what comes out of it. The other one that I would name is Diamine Sargasso Sea. That one can be a little bit temperamental, so it's not always a favorite, but it is worth mentioning as well as one you could check out. Cool. Next question from Fred R on Facebook. Based strictly on color, I feel that there are too many inks that I find must-buys because I have that particular color or another brand of ink that is very close. Oh, there aren't too many inks. Sorry, I don't know if I was clear about that. There aren't too many inks that I find must-buys. There are some inks that I'll stay in my collection for as long as they're made. You know, you quoted like Noodler's Apache Sunset and stuff like that. But I haven't seen anything lately in any price range that's different enough for me to try. Do you think there's room for any more distinctive colors in fountain pen inks? All right, good question. Have we just like saturated the market, pun intended, with fountain pen inks? And is there any room left for new colors? Well, I would say that yes, there are, but you need to get a little creative, okay? Do we really need another you know, conventional black ink that has no interesting properties whatsoever? No, we really don't. There's like 50 black inks. We're good. We've got black inks. Don't make any more black inks unless you can do something really cool with it. So that said, you know, we've got about 600 colors on GouletPens.com. That's a pretty wide range of colors. You can get pretty darn close to whatever shade of whatever color that you're looking at. Pretty much covers the full gamut. So the thing that's going to start to distinguish different inks is properties, okay? So properties in terms of shading, in terms of saturation, dry time, permanence, flow, ease of cleaning, all of these things, sheen, all of these things will come into play beyond just the shade of ink that you might see in a swab on our site, okay? So you might see several different dark blue inks and be like, why do you have so many dark blue inks? Well, some of them sheen really well. Other ones, you know, it's got a permanent component to it. Other ones, you know, whatever. There's a lot of different things going on. You know, Jeroboam Stormy Gray is a good example that I'm going to highlight. It's a gray ink, okay? There's plenty of gray inks out there, whatever, who cares? It's not a very popular color shade in general, but Stormy Gray has had people going bananas because it's got a gold sheen to it. It's got an intense gold fleck that is unlike anything else. So they took a conventional gray ink and they made it an unbelievably desirable ink because they had that additional property to it of the sheen. So yes, I do think there is room to do more cool stuff, but companies are going to have to be innovative and creative. It's not just a matter of, you know, coming out with a range of 8 colors that includes a black, a blue black, a royal blue, you know, a turquoise, a red. You know, it's like that's been done. You look at any major pen company, they all have like 4 to 10 colors that are kind of just this spread of fairly generic colors. Do something that's really unique and interesting. You know, Jeroboam I will highlight as they have a pretty somewhat, you know, conventional line of about 30 inks, and then they came out with the 1670 series, which has these crazy intense sheens and sparkles and stuff like that, and people go nuts for them. So they are innovating, which is pretty cool to see. Noodler's innovates with crazy properties, UV resistance, and you know, glows on the black light, and invisible ink, and you know, permanent inks, and all these kinds of things. You know, even just kind of unique colors and inks that change color when it gets wet and stuff like that. You know, that's really interesting for people, and it kind of freshens up the experience for people who've been in fountain pens for a while and they're just kind of sick of using yet another turquoise. You know, so having things that shade really intensely or change color or do whatever kind of thing, that's where it's really gonna get interesting, and that's what excites me personally after having used so many inks and stuff like that. So I do think there's room for more. People are going to have to get kind of creative in general. So I think I hit most of that question. But the last blanket thing that I will say is if you're looking and no ink is exciting you at all, then just stick with what you got. There's nothing that says that you have to go out and buy new inks. You know, just if you're really happy with what you got, just use them to your heart's content. You know, use them in different pens. You can just experience different ways of writing even with the inks that you have. So you don't feel like you have to go chasing waterfalls here. And then just the last thing I will say is, if you do have anything you're even remotely interested in, get a sample of it. That's why we offer samples. Get a sample of it and actually try it in a pen and then see, because sometimes when you try it in a pen, you experience something much different than you would just looking at a swab. All right? This question is from The Real Jackie Ma on Twitter. Is Noodler's Black Eel similar to Noodler's Black with the additional lubrication? If so, why isn't it a top recommended ink? Noodler's Black is currently the best-selling fountain pen ink that we have at gouletpens.com for a lot of reasons. It just gets talked about a ton. It's a great ink. Black ink is very universal. A lot of people need it. It's permanent. It's very well behaved, easy to clean, and so on. A lot of good reasons that people do it. No, just Noodlers in general. People just like what Nathan Tardif has done with the brand and the vibe that he has with that. You know, so that said, why isn't Noodler's Black Eel anywhere near as popular? Because it's not. It's basically the same ink with added lubricant. And the reason why the lubricant is added there is because Nathan wanted to develop an ink that was better for self kind of cleaning and maintaining a piston filling pen. So you have a piston filling pen for ones that aren't easy to be disassembled and silicone greased, like TWSBI. Other brands that they don't want you to take them apart, like Mont Blanc and Pelican and stuff like that. If you're using a lubricated ink, the extra lubricant in the ink will help to keep that piston seal working smoothly. That's why Nathan developed it. Now, kind of a side effect of it that probably was actually the reason why more people buy these lubricated inks is it causes the ink to flow wetter out of the pen. There's a couple of good and bad things about it. So flowing wetter, if you have a dry writing pen, it can help to kind of salvage your experience with a dry writing pen, make it write wetter and more enjoyable. It also just flows really smoothly even if you don't have an issue with how dry something is writing. Some people just like to really write effortlessly. So it's just going to flow wetter in general. Some disadvantages is dry time is going to be extended because it takes longer for lubricated ink to dry on the page. It's also going to tend to feather a little bit more because it is rushing out of the pen. It's those lubricants do affect the way that it looks on the page a little bit. So those are kind of the two main drawbacks, as well as you're going to have more nib creep. That's really an aesthetic thing. Sometimes it bothers people and sometimes it doesn't, but it is something to point out as being more of an issue. So I think just because Noodler's Black in general just really is kind of like most people's perfect ink, the fact that you have another one that's more lubricated that has some of these little side effects to it with the added lubricant means that it just kind of drops off of most people's radar. And plus, everybody wants kind of like a single go-to recommended ink, and Noodler's Black just ends up being the one that most people choose. Now, more of a question would be, why isn't Heart of Darkness closer to Noodler's Black? Because that is really similar in property. Very, very notable, hard to tell differences between the two, but a lot of people really love it. It just acts a little bit differently on certain types of paper and stuff, but those two are actually much closer in terms of popularity than Noodler's Black versus Black Eel. So it is kind of an interesting observation. I think most people maybe aren't aware of what the eel thing actually means, but try a sample of both and see if you can tell the difference for yourself if you are interested in that. Next question is from Matthew M. on Facebook. Matthew asks, is the pH of ink in modern formulations something I should consider? If so, is it more of a concern for archiving documents or the health of your pen? Okay, so technically, yes, pH is something that can affect both archivability and the health of your pen. Exactly how, I can't really say. pH in either extreme is really not great. If you have really acidic, then it's going to eat away your pen, and it's not going to be great for whatever paper that you're using it on. Really basic as well is also not going to be good. It's also not going to mix great with other types of ink. So if you aren't cleaning your pen out as thoroughly, it can have some mixture issues. Now, here's the tough thing about pH. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm really talking a lot and getting thirsty, so give me a second. The extremes of the pH is not really ideal, but the most frustrating thing is the fact that basically no manufacturer tells you what the pH is for any of their inks. So I think it's more of an issue with vintage inks because they used to have inks that were in much more extremes. They now have kind of formulated most modern inks to be just generally a lot friendlier and a lot safer. I hesitate to really say that definitively, and some of you who are kind of vintage ink experts may just completely rip me apart on that. So if you do have a great working knowledge of vintage inks, please do share. I invite you to shoot holes in my theories here because I am not an expert in kind of the vintage ink, nor am I a chemist, nor have I done any pH testing on any of the inks I carry to tell any of this stuff. So this is all kind of stuff that I've been from participating in conversations about pH over the years, and I know there's some people who are much more in, like chemists and biologists and stuff like that, that have done some testing of things like on Fountain Pen Network and posted some of their findings. What I can say is that as a retailer and from selling a lot of ink to a lot of individual customers, getting feedback on it, I really can't say that there's like any one ink that really is any extreme and has been kind of an issue or the recurring thing. You know, Noodler's Bay State Blue gets a lot of flack. I don't know that it's just a pH thing. It is a little bit higher pH. I think it's a pH around 8 or 8.5. So it is a little bit higher pH, but it's also just kind of a differently formulated ink. So there's an element of mystery around some of these things. So as much as I could talk about pH and stuff like that, it is a little frustrating because we don't really know what these inks have in terms of pH. Manufacturers aren't really coming out with that. You know, other than Noodler's, which in their standard line, you know, it says here like, you know, always pH neutral. So in their Noodler's Black and like a lot of their standard line, he does advertise that it's pH neutral. Aside from that, I can't really name any manufacturer that really says anything about their pH. Doesn't necessarily mean that's not true, it just means that it's not something that's openly advertised, because I don't think it's something that most people really take into account. So I guess that's kind of where we stand, you know, and in terms of like permanence and archivability and stuff like that, it's hard to say exactly because, you know, if you think about iron gall ink, which is some of the most permanent stuff you can get, that stuff is extremely acidic. So I don't know that acidity really affects archivability in and of itself. You know, I'm starting to get into an area where maybe I'm not quite as much an expert when we get into ink chemistry. You know, there's certainly people that are more knowledgeable of that. You would think handling as many inks as I do that I would know more of that, but there's more education that's required to be able to understand that level of stuff, and, you know, kind of testing with equipment and stuff that I don't have or have access to that would be required to answer this more intelligently. So I'll just go ahead and quit while I'm behind talking about that. So given the fact that you have very limited knowledge, I don't think it's anything to be too greatly concerned about, just in general, because if an ink was really that bad these days, you would know about it and it would probably not be offered. I have a couple of business questions for this week, some really interesting ones, okay? Well, two of them, the second one's really interesting. So the first one I'm gonna get into, somebody asked about ink drop. So John S. on Facebook, how do you choose the inks for ink drop, and why are there often German inks in the ink drop? I don't know what you have against German inks, John. They make some good inks. So anyway, I'll go ahead and address both of them. So we're just gonna be hitting our 58th, I think it's our 58th ink drop that we've done, which is insane when you think about that. We've been averaging about 5 samples per drop. We've done some that have been more, but just assuming it's been 5 samples, that's over 290 inks that we've done so far, with remarkably few repeats. We really resisted repeating anything for a long time, and it just got to the point where we were really having to scrape the bottom of the barrel to try to get a decent theme together. You know, we certainly try to work in and feature some lesser popular inks, but it was getting to the point where it was like, man, these are inks that like really nobody's gonna want. So, you know, we have about 600 colors altogether. And, you know, there's no question that there's like an 80-20 rule when it comes to ink. Like 80% of the inks are like 20% of what actually sells. And then like 20%, the top 20% is 80% of what sells. That's a pretty common rule in just about any business. It certainly applies. I don't know if that's the exact like calculation. I think we might have calculated some of that. It might be a little bit different than that. It's spread a little bit differently, but it's not going to be that far off. So, you know, that said, when we start getting to like the lower half of the inks that we offer in terms of popularity, we're getting to some ones that are really just not as great to use in ink drop. And probably one of the biggest factors that you may not even think about in terms of what we actually select in ink drop is availability. Just being able to get the ink at all to do in an ink drop is an issue, especially when we get to these lesser popular colors. When we try to feature a less popular color, the challenge that we run into is that because it's not a very popular color, our distributor, or maybe even the manufacturer, doesn't have enough of it to even use in an ink drop. So I won't go into too much about like how many members we have and all this kind of stuff, but we use a fair amount of ink for these ink drops. So it's basically at the point now where we're using more ink in a given ink drop, unless it's a really popular color. If it's something that's not as popular, we are using more inks in a given ink drop than even our US distributor will keep on hand. So we have to tell them far enough in advance which inks we intend to use so that they can get it from the manufacturer and order it in the quantities that we need so that we can include it in the ink drop. Because it's not only, keep this in mind, not only is it the inks that we want to actually use in the ink drop, but then that's a lot of people that are getting samples of this ink. They might fall in love with it and they want to buy a bottle. So we got to make sure that we have enough to actually do the ink drop, but then also have bottles available for people to buy should they want to do that afterwards. And it is always like trying to predict the weather, you know, as far as how that's going to work. Especially because we offer sign-ups for ink drop throughout the month. So if we have a really popular ink drop that month, it gets promoted, we can have you know, several sign-ups that happen for ink drop after the month has already been released and we've already done our reveal. Then you're in the situation of, you know, we don't exactly know how many more people are going to want that month beyond what we were already able to predict. So, you know, there's a lot of variability in there, which kind of makes our life a little bit harder, but it's of greater benefit to everybody out there who might be interested in an ink drop. So that's why we do it that way. So it does make it so that we have to plan ink drop very far in advance. You know, we're at the point now where we're planning November and December. And actually we're kind of like getting a little squeamish about having not done that yet. So we're going to be working in the next week or two to plan November and December's ink drop. So it does make it hard to be agile in terms of what inks we're going to use. That said, there's really not a lot of like new inks that are coming out these days, so it's really not as much an issue. We carry pretty much every brand that we can currently. You know, the only one that we don't carry like kind of the full line is Diatramentis, because there's a lot of different colors and a lot of repeat colors with different just like names on them. So, you know, we do have a mix kind of there. So, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in general, we're planning out, you know, 4 to 6 to 8 months in advance, mainly just because we need to in order to make sure that we get that ink. And so when we plan it, we kind of come up with a theme. We have a kind of a running list of every ink that we've ever used in ink drop and when. And we make sure now, you know, we are doing repeats now, but we're making sure that we don't do any repeat that's happened within the last 2 years. That's kind of what we came on, because it got to a point where we'd been doing it for about 3.5 years. We had never done a repeat, and it was like, we are really having a hard time. We have these great theme ideas, but we used this ink 3 years ago, and there's only like 7 members that were even still members that were members at that time that, you know, would be getting a repeat, and that was 3.5 years ago. Are they really going to care if we repeat this one color? So it got to the point where we crunched some numbers and we were like, okay, if we don't repeat within 2 years, that's plenty of time. There's only going to be such a percentage of people that would even get a repeat, and then that was 2 years ago, and they would probably be okay with getting a repeat again. So we have a running tally of what we've used, and we don't pick anything from the last 2 years. So I've said that like 8 times. So we pick it, and then, you know, it's our media team. They're like more of our creative bunch. Our media team kind of comes up with it, and once we kind of come up with the idea, we pick several different colors that we think will work. Usually it's like 8 different colors. We try to pick a backup for every color because sometimes we can't get enough. And then our inventory team goes and contacts all of our different vendors to see and make sure that we can actually get it. Sometimes, like if we're dealing with, you know, Noodlers or Diatramentis or some of these like smaller boutique companies, it might be that we have to tell them so far in advance that they actually have to know how much they need to make to be able to do it. So it's not just a matter of going through a distributor and making sure that they're ordering enough, but it's talking to the manufacturer and making sure that they are capable of even making enough. So it's an unbelievable amount of coordination that's required these days, but it's a labor of love, and it's very worth doing on our part for your sake. So once we do that and we confirm, once we actually have all of the ink physically in our possession and we're planning out months in advance, we get it, we're like, okay, we know we're going to be using these for ink drop because we have it. Then we design up the cards that we include with all the packages, get those printed up. You know, it takes a couple of weeks for those to get printed and come back, so we try to get those done at least a month in advance. And then once that's all done, we're ink sampling. It's pretty much the ink sampling happens like the few weeks before the ink drop is actually sent out. So say like right now we're working on July. I think we're a little slower right now, so we did July just a little bit earlier. You know, we got some vacations and stuff that are going to be coming up with some of our teams, so we kind of navigate that in there too. It's a lot to coordinate, as you can tell, as we're talking here. It's quite a bit to juggle just to even be able to make ink drop happen. And then you get into like all the different billing and all that kind of stuff. It's quite an effort, way more complicated than we, you know, than it was when we kind of first started it out. But it's a labor of love, and we love it. So that said, why are German inks so often in the ink drop? Honestly, a lot of it is just because of statistical probability. You know, if you look at, I actually went through our site, here's all the German ink brands we carry. Diatramentis, Rower and Cleaner, Lamy, Pelikan, Super 5, Faber-Castell, and Kaweco. So all of those are German brands. So it's about 145 inks in total there. We carry about 600, so that right there is a quarter of the inks that we carry come from Germany. Germany has a strong fountain pen culture, lots of companies based out of there, so there's going to be a lot of German inks in the drop purely because there's a lot of German inks, you know? So that said, if you look at kind of the spread that we end up doing, it's really not that much of a factor. We don't really, unless we have a theme specifically based on a country or continent or something like that, we really don't take country of origin into account when we're designing ink drop. It's really more a matter of, can we even get this ink? That's our biggest hurdle that we get over. So yeah, that's kind of where it is. I will say too that, you know, Diatramentis ends up working in there, especially like, you know, think about like Diatramentis, Super 5, Faber-Castell, Kaweco, some of those. We haven't been carrying those brands as long as we have Private Reserve, Diamine, Pelikan, Noodlers, those kind of things. So we used a lot of those brands that we've had for a while earlier in the ink drop. So a lot of those, especially if they're in the last 2 years, we're not going to repeat those. So when we have a newer brand, then we're going to be pulling more of those because there's more available out of all of the ones that we haven't used yet. So that then probably increases the number even more. So that's kind of where that stands. And then just in general too, with Diatramentis specifically, they have a lot more interesting names for their inks than a lot of the other companies. Noodlers does too, which is why they get used a lot, and it's just a lot of popular colors. So like Noodlers and Diatramentis probably just as a whole tend to get used a little bit more in ink drop because it fits in a little better with the theming. You know, the ink properties and stuff people like, but the theming, it makes it really nice to be able to work it in there. And they have you know, a wider range of colors that are kind of more unique. So that's where it kind of all comes from. So hopefully that gives you a little insight into how ink drop works. Next question I have, Patrick D on Facebook. This is a good question, and I'm going to take a sip of water before I get into it. I'm talking a lot on this one. How long have I been talking here? I don't even know. 40 something minutes? Okay. That's not going to be a short Q&A. Never is. Patrick D on Facebook asked, how much would you like to grow Goulet? Is there a size for your business that you see as ideal? Where do you see the tipping point at which the size of Goulet makes the personal, hands-on style that you have be impractical? Well, give a little bit of background here. Our initial dream that Rachel and I had was for both of us to be able to draw a paycheck out of this, because I worked for 3 years making pens and never saw a paycheck, and in fact ended up losing money on the whole deal. So I volunteered my time and lost money pen making. So that wasn't a super great feeling. So kind of the goal with being able to continue doing any of this stuff was I have to be able to get paid for the effort that I'm doing. So employees was really not on our radar at first. Honestly, our ultimate dream was to run a small business out of our house. We had no idea that it would be a big thing. We just thought we'd be lucky blessed, if you will, to be able to pay ourselves for doing the work that we do. So that was really, for the first year, that was the only thing on our radar, even a little bit beyond the first year. It wasn't until we were working 18 to 20-hour days, I am not joking, 7 days a week, that we realized that that probably wasn't super sustainable. And we either needed to look to hire people, and I say that rolling my eyes because that's really how it felt back then. We either had to hire people or we would have to just cut our services back. And we didn't really know how to do that. What are we gonna like stop answering emails or not blog or review products or start, you know, shipping terribly or something? Like, we didn't know like what we would be able to cut back because it was just in us to do things the way that we do it. So really we kind of saw our only option was to either burn out and self-implode or hire people. And the only reason I kind of like roll my eyes at hire people is because that was not in our initial plan. And maybe that's like a big shock thing for you given like the size of our company now, but just be quite honest with you, maybe it gives you like some like hope and inspiration that like you can like kind of figure things out as you go and you don't have to have a 5-year business plan spelled out to the T to actually be successful. In fact, I would argue that being nimble and adaptive and rapidly growing and learning quickly is more useful than having a 5-year business plan, because a 5-year business plan is total crap for most businesses these days anyway, given the nature of how quickly things change, especially if you're in retail and you're dealing with social media and all this kind of stuff. Tell me that you could have predicted that Periscope and Pinterest and Instagram and all that 5 years ago would be anything. So, you know, it's just, you have to be able to quickly adapt being in the business that we're in. So that said, we knew, and I think we kind of like, we resisted hiring anybody because Rachel and I are such doers. We are so hands-on and we just love doing the work that we knew it was going to be really, really hard to try to train anybody to care as much as we do. And we really knew that that was going to be a ton of effort and weren't initially excited about that because we knew ourselves that training and motivating and, you know, coordinating and inspiring and all that kind of stuff that's required to run a good team, that wasn't our skill set. That was something that we were going to have to really stretch ourselves to learn. And as soon as we made that decision, like, okay, we are either opting to self-implode or we are opting to really challenge ourselves and learn a whole new skill set that's required from the initial starting of the business. And we said, we got to grow it. So, because it's there, it's happening anyway. So that's what we decided to do. And so for me personally, Rachel's a little more of a technician, a little more hands-on. For me personally though, I knew that leadership and mentorship and training and managing, whatever you want to call it, that was going to become my passion. And it very much has been, and that's actually something I really enjoy now about what I do. I still get a good mix of getting my hands dirty and playing with pens and doing the social media thing and being the subject matter expert and all that. That's great. I really love that. But that's not the majority of how I spend my time these days. It's really having meetings, mentoring, training, you know, helping with, you know, challenges and communication and motivating and, you know, all like company culture and all this stuff. Like, I have really embraced that over the last three years especially. I kind of resisted a little bit at first because it was unfamiliar to me. And once I realized the benefits of investing so much in our people and our team and our culture and values and all this wonderful things that you see with well-run companies, I realized that that was really going to be my calling as this business grows. That said, I've gone on a very long path to answer your initial question of how much would we like to grow it. The honest to goodness truth is, I don't really know, because I had no idea that we'd be this big. We thought maybe once we got over the initial like, oh, we're gonna have to have, you know, people work for us. Once it was beyond just me and Rachel, as soon as we moved the business out of our house, that really just changed things for us. Because we had our business in our house. Initially, the vision was like, we have our small, tiny business. Maybe our kids would work with us eventually as they get older, and we just keep it in the house and ship products out of our garage and whatever, we'd be happy. But that very quickly outgrew what we initially thought. So the first year, it was just me and Rachel working. It was great, getting our pipeline up, carrying lots of new products, building reputation with our vendors, learning social media. Once we hired our first team member back in 2011, early 2011, it then very quickly started to grow, because what happened was Rachel and I were not slam busy shipping orders and things like that. We had help doing that, and so when I got help packing up and shipping orders, I then spent more time in products, more time on blogging, social media, and so on, doing essentially marketing, content marketing, if you will. So that generated more business, you know, learning products better, carrying new products, growing the business. As soon as that happened, we needed more people to come and help doing some other things. And that's essentially what we've done over the last 6 years, is since we started the company, and I say 6 years, it hasn't quite been 6, but you know, as we have brought in more people. It's been 4 years since we've had it, you know, beyond me and Rachel. As we brought people in, we've trained away things. Rachel and I have taken on more aggressive things and grown ourselves, and the business has grown. If you're a fan of John Maxwell, I think I've got some John Maxwell books over here. Here you go. John Maxwell, level 5, no, sorry, 5 levels of leadership. He talks about that. Oh no, not that book. What am I doing? He's got a book called 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. That's what I'm trying to get at. Okay. Law number 1 is called the leadership lid. And it talks about how your company can never grow beyond the ability of its leader. So if you want to grow your company, you have to grow yourself. And before I got onto any of the John Maxwell stuff, I inherently knew that. I knew that I was going to be the limitation in my managerial abilities and my knowledge of just how businesses run and stuff like that. I was going to be the bottleneck if we wanted to grow this business at all. So everything in the last 4 years since we started hiring people has been me trying to grow myself very aggressively. That's why I read all these books, because I'm trying to grow myself so that I can continue to grow this company and have more opportunities for the people on our team. And it's been working so far. It's been working so far. I've done a lot of things wrong, but I've also done a lot of things right too, and so has Rachel. So we're still learning. You know, as we like to say, a good Dave Ramsey quote is, our school colors are black and blue. We take a lot of hits and we learn a lot of things, but you know, to continue to answer your question here, we have no specific goal in terms of revenue or number of team members or size of our company or anything like that. So really it's more a matter of, I guess it's kind of more of an ideological thing. Like, we want to run our business a certain way and have a certain personal feel about how we do things. And we're just naturally going to grow or not based on how well we live that out. So we have experienced a lot of growth pains regarding keeping that personal touch. I mean, you think about, in 4 years, we've gone from 2 people, me and Rachel, to 30 people, and we're hiring more. So that's going to be challenging to try to keep the same reputation and feel and everything growing that quickly. And it has been a huge challenge, and without very intentional, specific, dedicated focus on keeping that same feel, it would have really changed a lot about how we do things. Now, obviously, things have changed. I used to do the handwritten notes for every order that they went out years ago. Now we have a team of 6 people on our customer care team, with other people who jump in when things get really busy to help handwrite those orders, handwrite those notes on your orders as they're going out the door. It's still a personal touch, still has the essence of it. Yes, I am not signing all of them, because if I did, I would be doing nothing else. So yes, we have other people to help with that kind of thing, but the essence of it is still there. And that's how we've grown, is we've taken the essence of that personal feel and impregnated, no, not impregnated, that's a weird word for that, but infused it into everything that our team does here, and been very intentional about that. So your second question, I laugh, because where do you see the tipping point at which the size of Goulet makes the personal hands-on style that you built impractical? I would say that happened probably once we hit around 7 people. we already hit that, and we have already been suffering through that. Suffering is a very negative term, but we've been challenged to overcome that ever since we moved the business out of our house, which we had 7 people, including myself and Rachel, so really 5 other people. Once we moved the business out of the house, it really changed the feel of things for us, because we weren't running this mom and pop business out of our house anymore with a few people that were working in our garage. It was then, oh my gosh, this is a business. We have a business address. We have a landlord. We have, you know, all these other things that we really have to worry about now. It really feels more like a business. How do we keep business personal? And if you look at our site, you see that our purpose statement is to prove that business can be personal. So we didn't actually define that until around this time last year, just a year ago. But even still, we were living that out before we even clearly defined it in that way, in like a very concise kind of purpose statement. Yeah, we have already felt that tipping point, and we are constantly, that's something, constant conversation around here, is how do we keep this personal as we grow? And that's always on our mind, and we're always working and tweaking and trying to keep that going. So that's where it is. So that said, we're quite happy right now with the size that we are. If it was to be a lot bigger any sooner, you know, I would say that we would start to have, you know, more challenges that maybe we're not ready for, I don't know, but we're starting to hit some challenges as we're around 30 people that we haven't seen before. And as we grow, if we continue to grow, Lord willing, to 35 or 40 or 50, who knows, there's going to be other challenges, you know, like one of the things we're hitting right now is there just aren't a lot of fountain pen brands out there that are like well-known and popular that we don't already carry. So as we grow, what are we going to do? Are we going to go more upmarket and carry very expensive pens? Because those are some of the brands that we aren't really carrying right now. Do we expand into roller balls? Do we expand into other writing instruments like pencils or calligraphy? Or do we go outside of writing altogether and try and start a whole other leg of the business? You know, there's boundless opportunities. And I think what happens with most businesses 5 years in is they start to get very distracted and spread themselves out. And I've certainly been accused of that. You know, I just got an email from somebody last night who was like, you're getting into roller balls, is, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. You should really stick to fountain pens. You're really good at that, and that's what you know, and you're spreading yourself thin, and leave roller balls to the rollerball people. I get that. I get that argument. I disagree with it personally. I'm not going all in on roller balls, but I think strategically there are some roller balls that are of benefit to fountain pen people, or that fountain pen people who are like really serious and in love with their pens want to give pens to other people who just flat out don't want fountain pens. Roller balls are good. They're good for gifts for family members or whatever. So we're strategically easing our way into it as it feels natural. And if it totally flops, we're going to cut them, and I'm not going to worry about it anymore. I'm not going to force roller balls on anybody. But fountain pens are definitely still our bread and butter. I'm going to keep on rocking that pretty hard. No question about that. But the reason that most businesses struggle 5 years in is because you start to get fatigued, because you've been doing the same thing over and over and over again. It becomes, you know, an endurance run. And then, you know, your low-hanging fruit opportunities, you've already snatched them all up. So things get a lot harder in terms of continuing to grow. So you have to get more creative, more resourceful. You know, some of your people that have been with you maybe move on to other things. So you start dealing with turnover and training, and that gets fatiguing as a manager, as an owner, as the founder, to have people come and then go and move on to other things, even if it's for their own reasons and it's fully justified. It's just painful to see people come and go. It's a part of business though. So just being a young business owner, just, you know, working our way through that is something that we've had to learn and grow on, you know, and just, you know, helping people gracefully enter and exit as they transition through their lives. You know, just being a part of their lives for a period of time. Not everybody we hire here is going to retire with us, you know, and I get that. So still working through that and coming up with a graceful process for handling all that is a challenge. So there's definitely a lot of challenges that we have, but I'm very motivated by them, and I really love, still after this amount of time, still love what I do so much, and so does Rachel. And so we're going to continue to do it, and as it's natural, we'll continue to grow. But growth in and of itself is not our end goal. It's really only a matter of, can we continue to share the love, spread the goodwill, if you will, running our business the way that we do. If people like that and respond to it and support us in that by voting with their dollars and supporting our company, then we'll continue to grow to match that support. Very long answer on that one, but obviously something that I've thought about and is close to my heart. All right, as we extend into this very lengthy Q&A today, I have 4 more questions, so we'll see how I go through them. I got some personal questions. David S. on Facebook, which country, in your opinion, makes the best fountain pens presently? United States, Germany, Japan, China, and India, just to name a few that come to mind for me. Best is very subjective, so, you know, I'll have to just kind of interpret that. Best for me, it's hard to say. And obviously I'm a little you know, inherently biased because I don't sell any Indian fountain pens. I sell very few Chinese fountain pens. You know, most of them come Germany or Japan, US, maybe France, you know, just there's a few countries that really put out a lot of fountain pens. So the US really isn't making fountain pens like they used to. There's a couple of boutique brands. Edison is one, you know, Franklin Christoph is one, Bexley. Beyond that, really no major fountain pen, you know, Noodlers, but yes, they are made in various parts of the world. So Noodlers is certainly based in the US. The heavy manufacturing mostly is done in India for Noodlers. And various other parts. He does use a lot of American components, so it's hard to say like exactly how much of that is made in the US, if you will, but you know, even still, you're talking about Nathan, who's like one guy, Edison pens, a couple of people, Franklin Christoph I think is a couple of people, Bexley is a few people, so you're really talking about very, very, very small companies in the US, whereas things in like Japan, you got Pilot and Platinum and Sailor, much larger companies. Germany, you've got Lamy and Pelican, Faber-Castell, QOTW, you know, some of these other much larger brands. You know, and then China, they crank out tons of pens around the world, but, you know, they're much lower price pens. The quality of those is not as outstanding in general. India, same kind of thing. The quality is usually not as outstanding. So for me, it would be between Germany and Japan. Much stronger fountain pen cultures there, larger companies that have very outstanding quality control. Not that these other countries don't, but that's really, they're really known for that. Gosh, I really don't know whether I would choose Germany or Japan. I really don't know. I'm a huge fan of Pilot. I also like Lamy, and a lot of the German pens are really nice too. I guess, you know, if I had to pick, I would, gosh, it's so hard. I really don't know which I would pick. Really don't know. I can't choose. Can't choose. Sorry, I'm gonna let you down there. But, you know, that's just kind of it. So, that said, like, it's really more about kind of the culture and where it tends to be. France also has a lot of good fountain pen related stuff, more like ink and paper kind of things than pens necessarily that are coming out of there, but still, a lot of it has to do with the strength of the fountain pen culture. Patrick D on Facebook has a good question. What's the latest cake versus pie tally? Pie rules. Well, Patrick, I am a rather avid cake fan. Not that I don't like pie. I do like pie. But I just think cake is better. Sorry, let me correct myself. I know that cake is better. So, I'm making a lot of people mad right now. That said, our office here, the Goulet team, has swung remarkably pie lately, and you know, maybe it's I need to be more diligent about our hiring process to make sure that we're hiring cake. I'm just kidding. So it's definitely pie. It's probably like a 65-35 split here with pie. Maybe even like 70-30. Cake people, we definitely get picked on a little bit more around here. But I will say, a couple of Q&As ago, I asked a question, you may remember, about you know, posting the Q&A slices and how do you want us to go about it and all that. And got a good number of responses, about 130 responses out of that. So thank you all. I didn't really talk too much about that. The conclusion I got from that was like it was pretty split as to what people wanted. A lot of people just didn't even care. So that kind of told me like, all right, I don't need to stress it that much. And then I also discovered that you can actually turn off notifications for an individual video. So you know, we've been experimenting a little bit. If we have a kind of a slow week, we'll like put notifications for a few slices and kind of spread them out. If we have, you know, a lot more content, we might post some that don't have notifications and stuff. There's definitely a lot less views on those slices when we don't do a notification that publishes out to our subscribers. So, you know, it's kind of a trade-off. I don't want to go fill in your inbox with all these notifications of slices, but at the same time, I think they're good and have a benefit, so it might be good. I don't know. So it was kind of inconclusive. But the reason I bring all that up is because I snuck in, it was only a 3-question survey I had in there, and the third question that I snuck in was cake or pie. That was it, cake or pie. So I will say that with 130 entries in there from the Goulet Nation, if you will, it went 55% cake and 45% pie. So I can walk with my head held high around here saying that at least people who are loyal Q&A watching fans are, you know, perhaps brainwashed to appreciate cake more because of how much I talk about it. But there you go. I think America-wide, though, you know, pie is more popular. So, but that said, given the results of the survey, which I will use as the absolute definitive response for whether cake or pie is better, that we should all celebrate with a cake. All right. Julia L. on Facebook asked, I read in a Canadian press article that Robert Goulet is a member of Brian's family. Has Brian ever been in contact with the actor and singer? Well, the reason I have this particular picture here, I've had very limited contact with Robert Goulet, other than the fact that as a child growing up, I got called Robert a lot in class or by people that didn't know me that well. In fact, I kid you not, 2 days ago, I went to the eye doctor for a checkup, and I was getting a retinal scan or whatever the heck kind of machine, was taking a picture of my eyeball. And the doctor, who I've seen for like 3 years now, was just typing in my information, and he wrote Robert Goulet on the retinal scan document. And I was like, hey doc, I'm not Robert Goulet. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't even know why I did that, blah, blah, blah. So I still get it today, even though Robert Goulet passed away 8 years ago. But that said, he was an extreme, for those of you who don't know who Robert Goulet was, very famous on Broadway, singer, actor, put out a lot of different albums, very talented man. I also happen to be a singer. Definitely don't sound as good as him, but you know, I do not have the mustacheness of him, which I think he actually got an award from like the Mustache Association of America or whatever the heck kind of, there's like a mustache group that like honored him for having like representing well mustached people, you know, a number of years ago. So that said, you know, I do actually have my family lineage that traces back all the way to Jacques Goulet. I think in 1615, he left Normandy, France, and came over to Quebec, Canada, for the New World. He probably was intending to go a little further south because it's cold up there, and there were millers and farmers and all that, and farming up in Canada is not the easiest thing to do. So that said, my family lineage comes from the French Canadians up there over the last 400 years. My grandfather moved down from Quebec to Connecticut, which is where my parents were from. And then my family moved down to Virginia, where I was born. So I'm you know, true-blooded American, if you will, with an extremely strong French-Canadian heritage on both sides of my family, in fact. But if you trace back my father's lineage all the way back, in fact, if you go to Robert Goulet's Wikipedia page, it actually mentions in there that he's a descendant of Jacques Goulet. So I knew that we were both related somehow. So I went back and actually traced, because I was able to get his lineage as well, and I was able to trace back and find that we are actually 7th cousins once removed. And why the once removed thing, for those of you who don't understand anything about family lineage and all that kind of stuff, that has to do with basically like where the generations fall. So if you go back and trace back, for me, it's 7 generations. We have the same grandparents, or grandfather, whatever, the same grandparents. It splits off from there. But my family, you know, I come from a history of extremely large families. My father was one of 18 kids. So yeah, he was the 17th of 18 kids, if that tells you anything. I think his father was 57 when he was born. So very large families. Just so happens that a lot of my descendants were on the tail ends of their large families. So the generations are spread apart a little further. So even though Robert Goulet is significantly older than me, we're only 1 generation off in terms of our lineage there. So 7th cousin once removed. When I discovered that when I was a kid, I actually emailed him when I was 12 years old and said, hey, Robert Goulet, so this 12 years old, this would have been I was born in 1984, so this would have been in 96. I guess, right? Is that right? Yeah. So I emailed him in 96. Yes, email was very, very early on back then, but I did have email in 96. So I emailed him and said, hey, Robert Goulet, just wanted to let you know I'm a fan of yours. I've grown up my whole life being called Robert at times. You know, I have an uncle named Robert, you know, different guy, but I have an uncle named Robert, and I've just kind of known who you are just from having the same last name. I just want to let you know I traced back our lineage. We're 7th cousins once removed. That was neat, and just wanted to say hi. That was basically it, or whatever less 12-year-old elegant version that I had of that message, and didn't hear anything back for a couple of months. And then his wife, Vera, sent me a very nice, you know, typed up letter, and sent this personalized autographed picture of Robert saying, "Stay well, cousin Brian." And he signed it. And it meant the world to me at the time, because I'd never had any contact with celebrities or anything like that. Never made any contact with him after that. You know, that is kind of my claim to fame, if you will. And then, as it turns out, long after that, I got into singing myself. You know, I started out as a baritone like him. My voice is actually a little bit higher when I sing, so I'm a tenor too, for anyone who cares. Through show choir and through actually Virginia Honors Choir, which was a singing event when I was a senior in high school, that is actually how Rachel and I met. So had I never sang like Robert Goulet, I never would have met my wife, and thus we certainly never would have started the Goulet Pen Company together. So you can almost thank Robert Goulet in a weird way for, not necessarily, but you can thank the genes that Robert Goulet and I share, our singing genes, for me meeting Rachel and us ever starting this company. So very neat little point of fact there. And the one last thing I want to say, so yeah, like Robert Goulet, super classy guy, you know, definitely classy all the way. But the thing that I personally, the thing that I remember him for the most is when I was a kid. I was a big fan of The Naked Gun series of movies with Leslie Nielsen, and his most memorable performance for me out of all the things that he did just as a kid was in 1991 when he was the antagonist Quentin Habsburg in The Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear. He was the bad guy. So that was pretty cool just to see him in a movie that I really liked as a kid. That was really kind of silly and kind of cheesy and like right up like that. The Naked Gun series of movies is just like right up my alley, just perfect level of ham and cheese, as I like to call it. So that's where I'll end that. Last question I have for this week is a troubleshooting question. So this is from George G on Facebook. Why do eyedroppers have a tendency to blurp out ink from time to time, but piston fillers don't? That's a great question. And I've talked about eyedropper, you know, conversion and burping ink and stuff like that. But I don't know that I've ever done a direct, thoughtful comparison between an eyedropper and a piston. And why is that the case? So just for a simple, example that I'd like to show, I have a Noodler's Ahab that I've taken the piston mechanism out, so it's just eyedropperable, and I have a TWSBI 580. So TWSBI 580, it's actually 580 all, not that that matters for this example, but it's got an ink capacity of about 1.4 milliliters. Eyedropper conversion on a Noodler's Ahab is huge, it's about 6 milliliters. So why is it burping out? Okay, so there's a couple reasons. Basically, the reason that ink burps out, it has to do with pressure. That's the reason. That's why it can be an issue on airplanes sometimes, and that's why it's an issue with heat, whether it's leaving a pen in your car or holding a pen in your hand for a long time. It has to do with heat buildup, which increases the pressure of the air that's in your ink chamber, and when you're writing, your ink is down between the air and your feed. So when the heat pressurizes the air in here, that causes it to push ink out of your nib, which causes it to burp. So when you're writing for a long period of time, you're increasing the likelihood of burping happening if you have a large volume of air inside your pen. So why doesn't it happen with cartridge converter pens? Because a couple of reasons. When you have a cartridge converter pen, you're not directly touching the converter. So you're touching the body of the pen, which is not going to transfer the heat to the ink chamber. Also, it's a much smaller ink chamber that you're dealing with. Let me pull a Z24 here. So for example, like a Lamy Safari, you're not gonna get burping out of this pen pretty much ever, because you got your ink chamber here. It's a much smaller ink chamber, and it's got basically a built-in insulator here that is going to keep you from directly touching your ink chamber. So that naturally kind of works as an insulator. So when you have a pen like the Ahab in its piston form, it actually kind of works as an insulator as well. So the piston on the Ahab, as an example, and this is probably a bad example to use because most pens are not this way. They have the piston built into the pen like the TWSBI. But this, you've got the ink chamber here, but then you've got a whole other separate chamber that insulates. So when your hand is touching it, you're not directly touching that ink chamber there. So it's almost, in effect, kind of like a cartridge converter in that way. However, it is not a cartridge converter. Nathan Tardif will get mad if you call an Ahab a cartridge converter pen, because it is not. It is a piston. However, with the TWSBI, or most other piston filling pens, the piston mechanism is actually built into the pen. So when you're touching the ink chamber, you're literally touching where the ink is stored. There's no insulating factor here. So you think, why is it you get burping with an eyedropper and not with a piston? I think it's two reasons. Number one is when you have an eyedropper pen, you're dealing with a much larger ink capacity typically than with a piston filling pen. Because with a piston filling pen, you have the whole piston mechanism that takes up like the back half of the pen, or maybe even more. With an eyedropper pen, it's all ink space, baby. So when you get to an ink level that drops to about half, you have an ink reservoir that's got, for the Ahab, for example, 6 milliliters. When it gets down to about half, you have 3 milliliters of ink and 3 milliliters of air. In a piston filling pen, TWSBI is about 1.4 milliliters. So even when it gets halfway, you only have 0.7 milliliters, which is about typical of a cartridge converter measurement of just straight up air. So 3 milliliters of air, 0.7 milliliters of air. It's a whole lot more air to heat up and pressurize and force ink out of the nib. So I think that in and of itself is a factor, just the sheer volume of ink/air that you're dealing with when you're writing with these pens. But another thing, and I don't know that I've ever really heard anybody talk about this, but as I was kind of like deeply reflecting why this might be, I was thinking about when you're actually holding the pen. Like when I hold a pen, I hold it with my 3 fingers here, which I'm touching the grip of the pen, which doesn't really heat up the pen much. What's heating up the pen is holding it in the cradle of my hand here, okay? Now there's probably some heat transfer that's happening through my fingers, sure. And if you hold your pen further back, like I don't know anybody who holds your pen this far back, but you might have your thumb a little further back, that's gonna heat up the pen a little bit too. But I think most of it probably happens in the crook of your hand here between your thumb and your forefinger. So if you hold an eyedropper pen right there and your eyedropper is filled halfway, look at where the crook of your hand is. It's right on that section where there would be air in there. So as you're writing, your hand is heating up that air and it's forcing ink to then come out of the pen, or at least increase the likelihood of it. If I hold a pen like the TWSBI, I'm holding the grip of the pen, which I'm not touching the ink chamber at all when I hold it there. And in the crook of my hand is right on the piston mechanism, which is behind the piston seal. So all it's heating up is the air that's behind the piston seal. So the piston seal is actually acting as an insulator from the heat in the crook of my hand. Not to say I can't be having heat coming from my fingers, but it's probably significantly less because the crook of my hand is behind that piston seal. That, I think, is just as much a factor as is the ink capacity as to why you don't get burping out of a piston filling pen nearly as much as you do out of an eyedropper. Drop the mic. So that's it for that question. That'd make a really good slice, Jenny, that question. Anyway, so that's it for this week. I do have a Goulet Q&A question of the week for anyone who has endured this rather lengthy broadcast for today. My question is, do you have any cool like memorabilia or autographs or anything that's signed by a famous person? Doesn't have to be somebody you're related to. That would only be a bonus. But do you have anything cool and with a kind of a cool story too? I mean, my story was not that cool, but do you have anything, any cool memorabilia signed by a famous person, and how did you come by it? That would be kind of interesting to hear. And one last interesting point of fact regarding my Goulet heritage. If you go all the way back to Jacques Goulet, I am also 10th cousins with, what's her name? Shoot, of course I'm forgetting it now. She's married to Brad Pitt. What the heck is her name? I can't even remember. Oh my gosh. I didn't write this one down. I just recalled it off the top of my head. Seriously, this is really gonna bug me. Oh my gosh. Angelina Jolie. I couldn't remember her name. Jeez, really, really good there. But we're 10th cousins. That literally means nothing. We're basically strangers, but we do share the same heritage. So that's kind of interesting. So I'm sure that's you know. I just forgot her name again. What the heck? Okay. I'm sure she is also related to Robert Goulet. Not that that matters at all. Okay, I've clearly reached the point of being able to construct sensical sentences together. Thank you for joining me for another Goulet Q&A. I'm very thirsty, but I'll wait 5 seconds until I end this. You have a great rest of your week. I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to join me on Periscope if you haven't already. I'm jumping on there lots and lots. Really having a fun time there. And I would love to, you know, just have you subscribe to my YouTube channel. We're just about to break 25,000 subscribers, which blows my mind, but I'm very honored by that, and I thank you for that. So be sure to do that. Tell your friends. Check out gouletpens.com for any stuff that you might want to get that I talked about today. And I hope you have a great week. And right on. Don't want to forget that. I forgot to talk about my Ninja Turtle shirt. No, I did talk about the Ninja Turtle shirt. Whatever. All right, Jenny, I'm tired.